Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Tapping into Tech Talent, Best Practices for Interviewing Senior Engineers. My name is Shayla, and I will be the host for today's session. And so before we get started, I would love to just jump into a couple of housekeeping announcements. Next slide, please. Perfect. So if you're wondering, we are recording today's session. We'll make sure that we're making it available to you all at the end of the session. And then also, we're really excited to make this as engaging as possible. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and administer a quick polling question. So please feel free to answer that poll as we're just getting started here. This is definitely something that we'll want to be discussing and addressing throughout the session as well. At any point in time, if you have questions about the topics that are being discussed, feel free to submit those via the Q&A section of the webinar platform. And you can also submit questions via the chat function as well. We'll make sure that we're doing our best to address those during the presentation, and then, of course, at the end of the session as well. So feel free to do that. And then also, one of the things that we would encourage you to do is, as we're having the conversation, please think about what your biggest challenge is when you're hiring senior engineers. Feel free to submit your responses via the chat. Again, trying to make this as effective and engaging as possible so that we can have more of a collaborative discussion. And so with that, I would like to welcome our presenters for today. So we have Dr. Neil Morelli, who is the Chief IO Psychologist here at Codility. Dr. Morelli is a seasoned IO psychologist that has a wealth of knowledge and experience within the talent assessment tech space in particular. And so very excited to have you on board today. And we also have Yusuf Lavabi, who is the talent acquisition partner here at Codility. Yusuf is an incredible talent acquisition partner. I myself have worked very closely with him over the last couple of weeks. And so he has a lot of really great insights to be able to offer to today's conversation as well. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Shayla. Hey, everybody. It's good to be here. Thanks for joining us. And as Shayla just mentioned, I am Codility's Chief IO Psychologist, so I think a lot about the science of what we do as a hiring solution, a hiring platform. And so I'll be going over some points here today that draw from IO psychology research and articles, peer-reviewed articles, so some of the evidence-based practices for what really great interviewing looks like. But that might feel somewhat academic or just somewhat like head knowledge. So Yusuf is here to also bring some of that experiential knowledge. He does these types of interviews all the time and can really provide some color and some context. And so we're going to have a great conversation and discussion. It's going to be a little bit more free flow. So as you have questions, please submit them to the chat. And as Shayla said, please let us know what the biggest challenge you're facing right now in senior engineer interviewing in particular. And we want to address that and sort of guide our conversation in those areas, in those specific topics that you're curious about. But we do have a lot of great content to come back to and to reference as we go through. And just to kind of set the stage, just so we know what some of the sort of the themes are. If you get nothing else away, you take nothing else away from today's webinar, is that in general, what the evidence says is that more structured interviews are a best practice. More structured interviews tend to lead to better outcomes when it comes to interviewing. And the same is true for hiring or interviewing senior engineers. So one of the things that I just wanted to do, again, just to kind of set some context here, is to go over some of the issues that you might see with a more free-flowing interview. Maybe you call it status quo, maybe you call it traditional or legacy, or just sort of the types of interviews that people tend to fall back to that tend to just be more free flow. They show up, they tend to ask whatever is on the top of their mind. Maybe they have their own kind of pet theories around what good talent looks like, and they bring that to bear with them in those interviews. So some of the issues with that approach, though, this more free-flowing or traditional interview, is that you can have some reduced efficiency and a lengthier funnel, which is really critical to getting the top talent that you need, especially for senior engineers. They've got other competing offers most of the time. So having something that is an efficient process and is not any lengthier than it absolutely needs to be is one benefit of a more evidence-based, more structured interview, as I mentioned. We all know about the potential for bias in these kind of free-flowing types of conversations. They might feel very natural, but they're just also opportunities and openings for bias to enter the conversation. So you might be, without realizing it, disadvantaging people from other backgrounds and diverse points of view. And then there's inconsistency that leads to that. So that increases the potential risk of a mishire. Of course, poor candidate experience. Part of the structure that we'll be talking about today, part of that is having interviews with training and with some background and with some preparation and a plan going into those interviews. Without that, they can lead to poor interviews. They might not just get the signals that they need. They might not be delivered in the best way. And that just degrades your employer brand and can reduce those acceptance rates that are really, really critical, especially for senior talent. And then, of course, if we are inconsistent, we've got poor candidate experience, we've got bias, we're inefficient, we have a lower quality of hire, a poor quality of hire, which just increases the organizational costs and risks. You might know some of these already, likely do, maybe you've experienced some of those. I'm curious, Yusuf, what are your thoughts on some of these issues, and what are your views around sort of like that kind of traditional status quo free-flowing interview?
Yeah, so I'm going to start by echoing what you said about this presentation that we're doing, this webinar. So you're kind of the academic voice and the theory, and I'm in the trenches actually doing all this stuff and benefiting a lot from the research that Codility does in my own job. And of course, also, taking knowledge from the vast TA network that I'm part of in Berlin. So hopefully I'll be able to give a bit of more practical, what is happening in the ground and what I've seen works well and what doesn't. And when we talk about free flowing, what happens is, what I've seen, the worst thing happen is that you have, let's say, you have 3 or 4 steps. In each step, the person that is interviewing the candidate doesn't know what the other person is doing. And in that case, you are basically doing something very, very random. It could be that you're hiring the best candidate, but the likelihood of that is quite low. So if I were to maybe summarize all of these points, what the structured interview does and what an evidence-based practice does is that it helps you bring that kind of half certainty that at least you've done what needs to be done to compare different candidates. And the intuition that comes from these free-flowing interviews can still happen at the evaluation stage. So you can still have a structured interview and add a little bit of intuition in there. So having a structure doesn't mean that you're not going to have a free-flowing interview. You're not going to have a bit of flair. Every interviewer has a certain way of doing things. So that's not we don't need to throw that away. And I would say probably we are talking about quality of hire, which is what is most important for companies, right? This is what touches the bottom line. So yeah, that's what I would say about this.
Okay, well, great. You actually brought up a point that I want to skip to here. Might come back to some of these, and we'll obviously make the slides available to you. But you mentioned one thing here that I want to come to, which is understanding the role of each person in the interview process and making sure that there is a plan there. Like you said, Yusuf, like that kind of inconsistency. It's one thing to have the delivery sort of be somewhat personalized to that interviewer style, as long as they're kind of following the steps and the plan that you have. But it's really important to align with the hiring manager between you're in the TA role, Yusuf, or the recruiter. Make sure that there's an alignment with the hiring manager in terms of what those criteria are, who's going to be asking about what, identifying the areas that you're going to be assessing. So whether it's the technical or leadership, just showing up and just hoping for the best and having the same conversations over and over again. That's where you get those that opportunity for bias to creep in, and just an inefficient process because you're not really adding any additional signal, right? So having that interview plan created and coordinated and aligned around what are the things that you're focusing on, those are also elements of structure. Maybe the delivery can be somewhat adaptive to the areas that you want to focus on, depending on the candidate's background, depending on their responses. But making sure that you go into those conversations with a plan and understanding which role each person is going to play between the recruiter and the interviewer, the hiring manager, that is another element to the structural piece that is going to get to better outcomes and more consistency. You have any thoughts on that? Working with your hiring manager counterparts, how do you align? How do you make sure you're on the same page?
So what I would say here, what I would add, I don't stop at the hiring manager, because this person that will join the organization will be working quite closely with other colleagues in the organization. They will be working with other teams. So what I do is involve also the people that will be interviewing directly. And I usually schedule calls also with the whole team to understand the team dynamics. What kind of personality we're looking for? What is this person going to bring to the organization? What are the skills that are absolutely necessary, and what are the skills that we can make concessions with? Where we say this person brings X skills, then we can just overlook another Y skill. So these are conversations that absolutely need to happen before the interview process starts, and obviously having a plan, knowing exactly what is the interviewing going to ask, how they're going to ask it, etc. So I've seen countless times, unfortunately, in my days also in the agency world, where I send the candidate and this candidate is absolutely amazing, and then they have a poor interview experience where the person kind of doesn't look like they know what they're asking for and what they're looking for. And when we're talking about senior engineers specifically, you have to think about this as a hiring manager and as an interviewer, and also as a TA. This person is evaluating your ability to interview and your ability to kind of explain what your company does. And everything you do during that process is a strong signal to the candidate. And this will be a factor in them deciding where do they sign the last offer that they have. Because at the end of the day, we know that the best engineers will always have another offer if they are if they're actively looking for a job. So anything you can do during the interview process to make them kind of feel, wow, like these guys know what they're doing. And when you have a structure there, this definitely gives the signal. And I've received lots of really good feedback about that. So I can tell you, like, invest the time in understanding the role, understanding the plan before you start interviewing.
That's great. And you mentioned a couple of things that I think we're going to get to a little bit later. Some of these other slides pick up on or support what you're saying there, Yusuf. But there's one question from the audience here that I think would be good to address before we move on from this slide. What's the optimal length of the recruitment process? So if we know we're going to have to align with our stakeholders, our counterparts that are going to be working together with us on that, how many stages should we have? How many steps should there be in your experience?
There's no good answer here, because it really depends on the candidate. It really depends on your organization, your employer brand. So usually, big companies like Google can get away with 10 steps, or they can make you go through hoops, because that candidates will love to work for Google. Not everyone has that luxury, so you have to be aware that you have to be mindful of how much effort the candidate is putting in this interview process, especially for senior engineers, where they kind of think twice about where do I invest an hour of my time to kind of know more about this company. So it's quite important. To answer your question, I think if you provide an amazing experience in each interview, it's you can get away with 1 step or 2 steps more, because the candidate is enjoying themselves. If they want to speak with more people in the organization, they want to be able to know more about what is it that they can expect if they join. So in our case at Ability, what we have is there is a recruiter screen that I do. Then we have either a code check and followed with a code live, or just a code live with a task directly live, so a live coding session. Then we have a system design interview, so that's kind of the third step. Then we have a hiring manager interview, and then the CTO also speaks with the candidate. So this is for a senior engineer. And I try to, as the TA partner, I try to kind of see whether the candidate is ready to do more steps or not. And based on that, and based on my alignment with the hiring team, then I kind of adapt that. For example, I could put the CTO and the hiring manager in the same call, or instead of doing 2 code live, then I do only 1, and then make it a little bit longer. So I kind of adapt the interview process to the candidate based on my interactions with them, and based on how they feel about the process. This is where the TA is responsible to build that relationship, understand what are their other experiences in interview processes. You get a lot of information about the market, right, from candidates. So just have that relationship with the candidate, and then adapt your process based on that. That's what I would say.
Yeah, those are good tips. One thing coming to mind I wanted to build on and add myself is, from what we've seen in the literature and from what other organizations have researched, generally there should be fewer steps than you think than there are today. There are probably too many steps. And why is that the case? Why is there a tendency to have the process grow and grow and grow? Well, people want visibility. Maybe they want to say that, maybe they want to meet the candidate. They're to put it another way, there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen at one stage. And so again, without that plan, without that structured approach to saying, here's what each stage is going to be targeting in terms of the criteria that we have, the competencies or skills that are needed for success, required for success, without that plan in mind, it's going to be very tempting and very natural to let that process grow and grow and grow. The more people that want to have some view or some visibility into those decisions that are being made. But maybe that's why a small panel interview is a good idea. Maybe breaking up certain interviews depending on their focus areas. So maybe there could be fewer evaluation type interviews and more of the attractive, let me tell you about how we work here. It's not necessarily evaluating the candidate. It might be more of a selling type of interview, but it's a chance for more people to be a part of that process and to have some buy-in. So having that plan and kind of structuring it around what are we looking for, who's going to be doing what, that's kind of going back to this slide and what we're saying here, but probably fewer is better. Youssef, you mentioned Google, and I suspect that there are still groups in Google that have pretty lengthy processes. They did a study several years ago that was interesting and found that after you get past 4 interviews, you actually lose beneficial signal gathering. So they actually found this like inflection point in the number of interviews that are being conducted, where they actually felt like, hey, more interviews is not adding to a more predictive decision, a better prediction about how well this candidate will do. So they actually, found around that kind of four interviews or so, a little inflection point, which I thought was interesting.
One more thing I'd like to add that
Sure.
I forgot to add there is explaining, because you touched on that, explaining what is that interview for. Because if I just schedule a call and I don't explain why we're doing it, then the candidate is like, okay, like why do they want to speak to me again? Why do I have to speak with the CTO? Why do I have to do 2 steps or whatever it is? So I see this as my role as a TA to explain to the candidate exactly what is it that we are going to interview for? What are the types of questions we're going to ask? And this, you cannot do that if you don't have a plan. So that's why we started with the importance of having a plan there.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to this next slide around what do we do during the interview. So we've prepared the interview. We know the targets that we're looking for. We're aligned with the stakeholders, and each one of those stakeholders knows the role that they're going to play. We might come back to the evaluation criteria and setting those up first, but that's another part of it too. It's not just enough to know what you're going to be measuring, but how will you measure that? What do good responses look like? And having some kind of indication of what response meets expectations, what is exceeding expectations or maybe falling short. So we want to take a little bit of time to understand what those criteria should be before the interview. But during the interview, Yusuf, you just mentioned setting good expectations. And that is a key term that we see in the literature when good expectations have been set, that there are realistic expectations, that you're establishing what the flow will be, you're letting the candidate know what the next steps are, and even the purpose of the rationale for that conversation. Again, that's easier once you have that structured plan in place, but that quality communication around those expectations and making sure that those are clear, that's going to help them perform at their best and detract or reduce the amount of anxiety that they bring with them into the interview. I'm curious, do you see that among senior engineers? How have they responded to those kind of conversations where you're kind of letting them know what's next, and how do they react to that?
Yeah, so I would say, senior engineers, like they've gone through probably hundreds of interviews in their lives. They know what good looks like, they know what bad looks like, and they're not ready to take the bad. So they know that if they are having a bad interview experience, this is a bad signal for what's coming once they get onboarded. I talked about that earlier. So when the senior engineer knows what is expected of them, what they are supposed to do in that step, then they can prepare mentally. And like you said, they are at their best, which means that you are not testing for their ability to deal with anxiety in an artificial fake interview setup that is absolutely useless at telling you whether this person is going to be a good collaborator, a good team member, and is going to be a high performer. What you need to do is start by making them feel comfortable, and then once they're comfortable, then they kind of have no excuse, right? So that's where you see whether this person is able to communicate well, whether they structure their thoughts well, and you are able to check lots of different things at every step of the way. And when we talk about having a plan, the plan includes which competencies do you want to identify or evaluate in each step. So let's say even during the technical interview, you can absolutely check for communication skills, or check for critical thinking, or check for computational thinking. Any of the skills in the ESM model. If you haven't done so, I would highly recommend checking out our
engineering skill model.
Yeah, so just to have an idea of what are all the skills that an engineer needs, and then trying to figure out how to evaluate each of them. This is what I would say here.
Great, awesome, thanks. And so we want the candidates to be at their best, and that means trying to set their expectations up front, and then even during the interview. And then when it comes to how to really deliver the best interview, I mean, there are some helpful tips here around, again, setting the expectations before you go through each stage of the interview. So let's say it's more technical in nature, being able to flexibly adapt within that plan. And I think that's the beauty of having a plan going into it, because Yusuf, you said you don't want to come off as too rigid, too robotic, okay, well, thank you for your response, now we're moving to the next response. You want it to feel like a human connection and a human conversation, but you still need it to be somewhat structured. You need to have some structure to it. And again, this is sort of the macro theme here, is more structure is generally better. but having some contingencies, some options within that plan to say, hey, we want to focus on these areas, but perhaps based off of the candidate's background, we can really drill down onto this particular area, or maybe depending on their response during the interview, you can then follow up and ask some clarification or verification questions on top of that response to really get a better, more holistic understanding of their knowledge or their skill or competency in a particular area. Do you have any other, real life tips, anything kind of tapping into this around how to deliver that interview that you've seen work really well for seniors? Anything else to add here?
So what I would say is, if there are any TA partners here listening to us, try to coach your hiring team. Try to make sure that they know how to interview, and if they don't, then you can provide some tips and coach them for the next time. I saw that the best, at least the best hiring managers I've worked with, what I do with them is the first time I schedule an interview for them, I shadow it. Either once or twice, and then give them feedback based on that. If I see that everything is going well, then I am sure that the candidate is having a great experience. And then I cannot be surprised if the interviewer is not very good or doesn't put the candidate at ease when the candidate doesn't accept the offer at the end, or they suddenly just disappear. Any recruiter here will know what I mean. So in order to maybe my main tip would be to actually practice and give feedback. So the recruiters or the experienced interviewers can give feedback to the ones that are not experienced. And really, when we're talking about hiring senior engineers, the people that will be doing or conducting the technical interview are also senior engineers. And interviewing is by itself a skill. And this is a skill that you need to practice, that you need to learn. So if you allow the people in your organization to learn this skill properly, to give them room to improve, then they will improve. I think they will also appreciate that in the organization and build that kind of confidence that everyone is hiring in the best way. And then you kind of improve the quality of hire overall, and improve the quality of people that you have in the organization. So like I said, coaching, learning, and give it feedback.
Yeah, and on that note about giving good feedback, we can give good feedback if we take effective notes. And that is actually the next slide here. And there's some tips around how to do that well. There's some very pragmatic things around using keywords and bullet points, having some kind of structure to how you take notes. Sometimes we can just tend to just throw in very open-ended, just, whatever comes to mind, we just throw things in there. But having some buckets, places for information to go, can be very helpful. Making sure to highlight strengths and areas for improvement. Capturing examples and specifics. This can be a very effective strategy when you go to any kind of rating of the candidate's response. Making sure that you capture those examples is really key. So, there are some ways to develop those skills. As Yusuf said, this is a skill to develop, and there perhaps needs to be training. So even I might recommend taking these bullet points and crafting them into a presentation for your team around some of the ways to take effective notes. Maybe they've never been confronted or challenged with the need to take effective notes during the interview. Maybe they just listen and don't take notes during the interview, and then they come up with a thumbs up for me or seems smart, those types of comments at the end. What kind of, maybe you have some examples, Yusuf, of maybe poor notes, like what do those look like? And do any of these tips resonate with you? Yeah.
I've seen it all. I mean, you can have the absolute best interviewer in the world, but if you don't know what happened in that interview, if this person is not able to very concretely tell you why they like this candidate, or what was happening in the interview, how did they evaluate, etc., then this is not a valuable kind of signal for you to make a decision at the end. It's only valuable when the person interviewing is able to give you, okay, this is what I was planning to evaluate. This is how, like the types of questions I asked. This is what I felt in the interview. This is my summary. Based on what I've seen, I think that this person is able to do X, Y, and Z. They're not that good at this or that, but maybe we can work on it. And then this is why I say we should pass or fail this candidate. So yeah, like you said, yes, thumbs up. That's very good, or a very smart candidate. That's not going to help a lot, and then you just come back to the free flowing interviews that we talked about earlier.
Right.
So that's just going against the idea or the concept of having a plan.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually a good segue to, so you've conducted the interview, you've set good expectations, you've sort of coached them through what the stages will be, having a plan going into the interview so you can adapt to how that conversation is taking shape, but still focusing on the target areas that are going to be the most helpful and gather the most signals in the best way, taking good, effective notes. But so the interview is concluded. Well, what's next? What do you do right after? And there are some tips here around evaluation and scoring of the interview. One of the things that we've seen is that your memory of a interview drops off very drastically within the next hour or two. So if you say, "Hey, I'll get to that rating a little bit later. I'll do it at the end of the day." Now you're operating off of a general impression, and that is susceptible to different types of bias. One of the biases that we talk about is halo bias. Maybe the candidate did really well answering one particular part of the question, and that influences all of your evaluations, all of the other ratings, because they did really well, and really impressed you in one area. It could also be more of like a severity bias, where you think that they performed poorly on one piece. Maybe they did other things well, but because they performed poorly on one piece, then you tend to be very severe in terms of your ratings across other dimensions. So it's really critical to fill out and evaluate that candidate as soon as you can with a structured evaluation or scorecard immediately after the interview, relying on those notes. So having those clear criteria set up, having your rating scales defined, looking across different dimensions. So maybe you're focusing on 2 or 3 different competency areas, and those are what you want to be really targeting in your evaluation. Focusing on the evidence. So that's where those are specific examples. And those really can impact and guide your evaluation. And then documenting your rationale and being able to share those results with others. Youssef, what are some of the ways that you've seen people capture their feedback and share it? Is this typically in a Google Doc, or is it just a quick Slack message? Give us the good, bad, and the ugly here of what you've seen in terms of evaluation.
The best practice here is to have an ATS, an applicant tracking system that has a scorecard a feature in it, so that all of this is in one place. Everyone shares their feedback in one place for all of the roles. What I've seen is basically everything, from Slack messages to just quick phone calls, or to really nothing. Most of the times, interviewers don't even recognize the need to give that feedback more than just yes or no. So you, as a TA, my role is also to educate the hiring team and explain to them why we need to do these things. Why do we need an evaluation on each stage? What I'd like to see, what the hiring manager wants to see from them, etc. So the general idea is that if someone writes something, this should be enough information for a third party to come in, read it, and understand what was happening in the interview and what was the outcome. That's how I would say it. And just a thumbs up is usually not enough. I would love to add just one little tip that I've seen work really well in terms of reducing bias. It's especially for the technical interview part, is having 2 or 3, maximum 3 interviewers. having maybe one person guiding the interview, and then the second person only asking questions sometimes. And then what I recommend at the end is each of them writes their own scorecard by themselves. And then once they're done, they compare their notes and discuss, why did you put 3 here and not 4? What did you think of this candidate's, this specific experience? What did you think of this answer? You will be very surprised to see that your impression of a candidate's answer is going to be very different from your colleague that is working with you in the same team. And this gives you kind of this way to reduce bias. Unfortunately, we are human beings. Bias is ingrained in us, so you can't really get rid of it. You can reduce it by doing things like this, and you definitely reducing by when you speak with someone else, you realize your own bias. So that's one tip that I would give, that I usually give to my hiring teams.
Right. Yeah, and we have that as a bullet point or two around panel interviews. And some people might resist panel interviews or feel like they're kind of high intensity or maybe high anxiety. But the benefits seem to outweigh some of those drawbacks there in terms of having multiple views on the same response. And if you're conducting the interview, it might be a little bit hard to capture that feedback and capture those or do those evaluations in real time. So having another person there too can also make sure that you're picking up on all the signal and reducing the number of interviews that a senior engineer has to go through, which an efficient, targeted, rational process is the way to go. You mentioned, go ahead.
Just on that, in case people wonder, like, oh, maybe having 3 people in an interview is not so ideal for the candidate. I've received this kind of objection many times. What I say is, if you want to have, let's say, 3 people in your interview, have only one person asking the questions, then the third person can just turn off the camera, turn off the audio, and never speak. In that case, once you get into the conversation, the candidate forgets that there is someone else there. It's not like you are in a room and presenting to someone. Once you're in the conversation, you kind of forget that other people are there. What I would say, of course, like we discussed before, setting expectations. So what I do is, before I schedule the interview, then I talk to the candidate. I say, look, there will be 3 people there. How comfortable are you with having multiple people? Do you feel nervous with that, in that situation? If they say yes, then I will try to just have 2 people or have only one person. So it really depends on what the candidate is comfortable with.
And that goes back to setting those expectations, communicating clearly, sharing the rationale. Those are all really good tips. And I want to turn to some of the poll results that we got initially, and as well as one of the questions as we're coming towards the end here. I was really surprised at some of these poll results. Half of our respondents to the poll said that assessing technical expertise was the most challenging aspect of interviewing senior engineers, and that one of the most frequently used ways of assessing technical skills of senior engineers is to use a coding assessment or in-depth technical discussion. And so I wanted to go back to a slide that we kind of skipped over for a second, which was selecting the appropriate content. And there's some really helpful tips in here. I definitely encourage taking a look once we're able to share the slides. But having realistic, face valid content is absolutely critical. What do I mean by face valid? Face valid is where a candidate would look at the content that you're asking them or the questions that you're asking them and seeing how that content relates to the job. On the face of the content, it is valid. It is relevant to the role that they're applying for. So not just a realistic type of experience, but also the content itself being easily identifiable as being job relevant. Those are crucial and really impact this idea of justice, that I'm being treated fairly, that this makes sense. And this will really resonate especially strongly with senior candidates. So selecting those tasks and those activities, those technical questions, if measuring technical skills is or technical expertise is one of your biggest challenges, having that content plan focusing on realistic, face valid tasks or activities questions are absolutely critical and will pay dividends. For example, focusing on system design and architectural questions. These can be really helpful for those senior level engineers. I'm curious, Yusuf, in your experience, what are some of the topic areas to assess technical expertise do you tend to focus on in your senior engineer interviews?
So I'm going to give my own honest opinion based on actually my most recent experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm going to talk a little bit as well about the ESM model that I mentioned earlier, because we always think a senior engineer is a technical guy. And it is true most of the time. However, there is so much more to a senior engineer than coding. When you look at a mid-level engineer, what you expect from them is really to code. What you expect from a senior engineer is not only to code, but to have these technical discussions, to collaborate with the team, to mentor other colleagues, to be able to be proactive, solve problems, all of those things, and lots of other skills that are included in that model. So I think what most companies do, and this is what I've seen across the board, a lot of people are focusing a little bit too much on the technical expertise and don't spend enough time looking at other skills. And what happens here is that if you are looking for an absolute, the best coder or the best programmer, and I'm using this specifically because I'm talking about the coding skills, then you might be missing out on maybe average engineers that are exceptionally good at explaining ideas to product managers, at collaborating with the teams. They have a positive attitude. They are able to, stay positive or find solutions to tough personal problems. Whatever it is, we are living we are experiencing a market where we need resilient people. And maybe the most resilient people are not the most technical people. So my caveat to kind of your question, and I see that most people have a problem assessing the technical expertise. I would tend to advise them to focus or try to give more attention to other skills and not only the technical part.
And that's a great point. I think that as you can see, the evaluating leadership and collaboration skills was sort of the next bucket. So that those are absolute challenges for people, it seems like. So those are good to focus on. And even if you're evaluating, say, a communication, collaboration, teamwork, or the ability to problem solve in a more abstract way rather than just constructing a technical solution, you can still couch those questions within a technical context. I think the one where you just mentioned, explain this to a product manager, a non-technical product manager, how might you do that? That's still taking that technical context, but it's getting into those collaborative elements and those communication skills. But having those criteria, knowing what a good response sounds like, putting that in your scorecard and having people trained on that, and even knowing that's going to be a focus area for your interview, those are all elements to structure that we're talking about here. It's not just the structure of what you're measuring, but also how you're measuring. It's really those two elements that come into play when you're structuring your interviews. Any other thoughts or things to add on the content piece? Anything that you see in terms of like the more desirable skills, especially for senior engineers, anything like that?
Generally try to link, because senior engineers have many years of experience and have experienced lots of things. Anything you ask, they should have seen before. So always try to ask for past performance. And we have this in the slide, behavioral questions based on past performance. For example, in my most recent interview that I was shadowing, the engineering manager asked an amazing question. They asked, look, I see in your CV that you have experience with this technology that is not relevant anymore today. Let's say you just get a company, you join a project where they ask you to change that technology. What would you do in that case? What have you done in the past? So this kind of questions is like a scenario where you're assessing their ability to come up with high-level solutions, but also you can link it to their past experience. So the follow-up question was, okay, this is what you would do, but have you done this in the past? Have you gone through a migration? Tell me what happened. What paint the whole picture so that you can get a feel of what did this candidate actually do, and how would they react to such a situation. If they're not able to give you past experiences, then they don't fully grasp what you're asking them. So this gives you already some kind of signal into their confidence and their skills.
Right.
Other than that, I would say, when you are doing a technical interview, what I've seen work really well is just having a free flow technical discussion as a part of the interview. So let's say part of the interview is discussing, let's say, a specific scenario. Here is a scenario, let's discuss it. And then here, what you want to see is their ability to think on their feet, like you ask them follow-up questions, and you discuss things as if you would discuss that in the real life. So this is something that I've seen also work quite well.
Yeah, and when we talk about behavioral questions, we mean the tell me about a time when, or share a story or an example of how you've done XYZ. And I think the questions that you might put in front of a senior candidate could be technical, it could be developing or describing a system architecture, but then following those up with those behavioral questions, tell me about a time when you had a challenge like this, could also be good verification. It's not just the conceptual, head knowledge, but they've also applied it, and that can help sort of validate that it's not just, hey, we're looking up the book answer here. We actually have internalized and have applied these skills in the past, and those are a better indication that you have a proficiency level that's needed. And the really cool thing about hiring or interviewing senior engineers is that you can ask those behavioral questions. If they're applying for a more senior level role, they likely have more experience, and they can draw from that experience to answer questions. That's not always a luxury that you have for more junior or entry level roles, where they might not have had that depth of background and experience. So you might rely on other types of questions. So pairing behavioral questions, to tell me about a time when, with the knowledge check questions, like the one that we see here on the slide around designing a system, those can be a really helpful one to kind of follow up. One other thing just to mention that caught my eye on this slide is that the reverse interview. So asking the candidate to ask the interviewer questions about what's in front of them to evaluate their management or coaching skills. That is also an interesting strategy, and could be helpful to get at those other types of competencies, where other than asking for just specific experiences and examples, you're actually seeing them demonstrate those with you as the interviewer. So we're coming up closer to the time here, and just looking at our feed and our chat, there's one question that is a little bit out of the scope, I would say, but maybe it relates to having a plan and knowing what the targets are and knowing what your competencies and your criteria are. And it's about, how do you identify qualified candidates, if maybe they don't have the information in their LinkedIn profile, or they might not use the keywords. So I guess this is going more towards the sourcing side of it. How do you actually get those senior engineers into that interview? What's the best way to have those conversations? Any thoughts coming to mind? Any tips there, Yusuf?
Employer brand, good job descriptions, making sure that you do the basics. I see a lot of companies jump directly to sourcing and try to find candidates in obscure places of the internet, when they haven't advertise their role properly, and no one is looking at the active applications or applicants. So my personal way is that I invest a lot of time crafting a good job description, figuring out which job title should I write. So you might think that this is this might be trivial, but writing backend engineer or software or senior backend engineer will get you very different types of candidates, and you might be surprised at, like, you might not get juniors or mid-level for backend and senior for senior backend engineers. You will get different types of profile and different types of experiences. So what I would say, start with the basics, and then once you see the profile, it's a little bit about experience, screening interviews, screening candidates, asking the right questions, and having a kind of a sense of what companies they've gone through, kind of imagining what they would be working on, and then asking those questions in the recruiter screening. I mean, this is why we have a recruiter screen where you ask the basic questions about their projects, etc., and not have, especially for senior engineers, you have to have a good recruiter doing this, and not just someone that just asks, okay, this is the list of questions I have to ask, and I'm just going to ask them and gathering information. That's not what the recruiter screen is for. What you need is someone that understands what are the kinds of questions I should ask, what are the things that that even for someone that is not technical, I can still ask and figure out, so that we know what kind of seniority it is. So in my experience, a good recruiter should be able to say, this candidate, even if they don't know anything about their technical skills, this candidate is senior material, staff materials, manager material, or they are not at that level. And you can kind of see that from all the skills that are not technical. Yeah, like I said, basics. And then once you have a good candidate in your pipeline, it's your responsibility to create an amazing experience so that you convert them. You don't need 10 good candidates to fill your role. You only need one. So once you receive that good application, make sure that you're doing everything right.
Absolutely. And you just use a phrase that is my soapbox. It's something that I like to preach whenever I have the opportunity to, is to have good job descriptions, spending a little bit of time to work collaboratively with your hiring manager, confirm that the job description is an accurate reflection of the role, and maybe even spending a little bit of time talking about the proficiency levels that are required that separate a senior engineer in that potential role from maybe someone who's at a mid-level or junior level. So having those ideas in mind and just having those clear criteria, that is the really critical input that can guide a lot of that structured planning that we've been talking about for the past about an hour or so here. There was one very practical question for you, Youssef. If you have a 3-person panel, one person's asking questions, one person's taking notes, what's the third person doing? What do you think is there?
First of all, everyone is taking notes, only one person. That would be, going against what we were talking about. The third person should be shadowing. So shadowing means you look at the candidates' facial expressions. How do they feel when they get the question? All these things, someone that is thinking about the question is not able to see. So you might be surprised if you just record the interview, for example, and you watch it later. You will notice things that you will not be able to notice in a conversation. Right now I'm speaking. If I watch myself later, I will see certain things that I'm not aware of right now. So these are the things that a third person would be able to spot that the other one wouldn't. So of course, this person needs to have a certain level of experience or practice to be able to add value. But generally, I find that this is quite useful.
That is helpful. Thanks. And I think this question is a really good one to end on, and we'll let Shayla share a few parting words with us. But what would you value more, a candidate with more technical skills, but maybe is lacking some soft skills, or the opposite? What do you think a manager would value more? Sort of a balance, heavier on one or the other?
I actually asked this question to our CTO not so long ago.
Yeah.
This is an excellent question, because there are various types of personalities out there. So you kind of have to know where you can make a concession. And the answer here is you need to look at what you have in your team. Map the skills that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Do you already have someone that is able to collaborate well? What kind of problems do you have in your team? Do you have technical problems, purely technical problems, or do you also have some kind of planning problems? Do you have motivation problems? Do you have maybe a process, like in process, whatever it is? So you need someone to come and solve your most pressing issue, or the skill that you're missing out on the most in your team. Let's say you have five engineers in your team. Each one of them ideally would have a strength. And wherever they are weak in, that's the skill that you should be looking for the most in a role. So to answer your question, let's say a software engineer role is never the same. You are hiring for a specific team and for a specific time and a specific seniority. I am very much against hiring just a software engineer for whatever. Let's just hire and that's it. We've seen this in hyper growth companies, and generally you have people that join and are not really fitting very well with everything. So I love the idea of having just one role and going very deep. What is the personality trait that we're looking for, and then trying to find that specifically. Of course, it's not perfect. You kind of have to see what's in the market, do some interviews, have conversations. But absolutely, before you start, have a conversation with the hiring manager and figure out what are the skills that we need.
Yeah. That's great. And it gets to this idea of complementary fit versus supplementary. If there's an aspect of complementing the team, focusing there, working with the hiring manager, having those targets in mind, those are all great. So I know we're at time. Just as we're closing, and if you're reflecting on something that we talked about, how to add a little bit more structure to your process, how to partner with your hiring managers to find those targets. Maybe there needs to be something that needs to go into the interview training and preparation for all stakeholders involved. Maybe you need to try a panel interview. There are so many good things here to take away, but just think about one of those things, and we just challenge you to write that down and implement it into your plans next week. So thanks for listening. Shayla, you have a couple parting words for us.
I do. Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank both of you for a really thoughtful and intentional discussion. We had a lot of engagement, a lot of really great questions from the audience as well. So to everyone that attended and participated and engaged in the conversation, thank you so much for your contributions. If you are interested in diving a little bit deeper into any of the topics that we discussed, I dropped a couple of resources in the chat section. Namely, I want to call out this technical interviewer guide. So this is actually kind of a supplementary material for today's conversation that actually provides a lot more in-depth insights and recommendations on how to conduct those structured technical interviews. In addition, I'm really excited to share that our engineering team is going to be participating in a conversation in a couple of weeks where they're actually going to go through kind of a mock interview and walk through some of the best practices and insights that were discussed today. They're going to do it within our platform so you can kind of see how they themselves are conducting those conversations. So I dropped a link to that as well if you're interested in attending. And then, of course, you can always go to our website to learn more about Codility and the solutions that we provide. So again, thanks to everyone for participating, for joining us. We've recorded today's session, and we will send that to you afterwards. Have a great day.